Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here. This is our last installment of labeling theory. And I don't know, it's a fascinating area, isn't it? Like labeling theory, it's like where we're looking at the process of something becoming defined as being deviant or criminal. Uh, we could look at a very macro level, think about historical time period and cultural values and the influence of particular social groups, the influence of political perspectives and ideas, the influence of positions of power and authority. So what's being defined as being deviant as a reflection of all that. And then getting into the assignment of a deviant status to others. Sometimes that's shaped by the status of the individual who's being identified as the deviant or the criminal. So somebody like race can matter in terms of the assignment of a deviant or criminal identity. Social class influences going on that space. Sometimes understanding labeling is understanding the audience, like, right? The audience, the one who's pointing the finger, the one who's assigning the label. And then we got to get into examine what about the impact of labels on individuals and how do people navigate and navigate deviant identities or stigmatized status. So that's labeling theory. It's complex. There's a lot going on. Hopefully you found last week informative, interesting, and we'll continue on with this week. So some preliminary questions and ideas. Well, who's involved in labeling? So we assign a meaning about tattooing. Where do those meanings come from? Or body modification? Who's involved in the labeling? Is it kind of like large kind of cultural kind of things? Is it particular groups? Is it institutions? Who might be the labelers? People that we're connected to, people within our community. So kind of got to address that in a way. And then think about what might the labelers, those who are doing the labeling, determine as the cause, or what is those who are doing the labeling? How do they think about the individual who they're assigning that deviant status to? Like, well, why is it? How do people account for why people would do what they do? So let's think about this way: you got an in group and out group. You got the in group who's the conforming, out group the non-conforming. And what is the story the in group is telling about the out group is the question here. And then what are the goals and the benefits of labeling individuals as being deviant or criminal? So think about, is there a function of identification of labeling or the labeling process? That labeling can be encourage pro-social behavior. It can encourage people to think about things in different ways, and maybe it's a social control mechanism that helps maybe individuals as well as society, kind of thing. So there may be some benefits to labeling. And then what are the factors that are influencing the labeling of deviance? We kind of already talked about that. All right, so let's kind of get into like some of our main themes here. Let's start with this first one here. Labeling theory addresses the process of making meaning. This is that symbolic interactionist perspective, like the focus on meaning and perception, language. So labeling theory is interested in all that stuff. The process of things becoming defined or no longer becoming defined as deviant or criminal. And then also the influencing of labeling on individuals and the response from others. So labeling theorists would be interested in looking at why are some acts punished or some acts responded to and others not. And it may not be about the objective level of harm. So this is where we separate out in some sort of way objectivism, the actual reality, so the actual degree of harm, let's say, versus the meaning that we've given things. And there can be definitely a distinction between the two. Those two things do not have to be aligned with each other. In fact, oftentimes, maybe they're not. Or even if we have something that's objectively, we are measuring and say, oh, man, there's a big increase on opioid use and a lot of problems and issues associated with opioid use in the United States over the last 10 years, let's say. So that could be very, an objective analysis of that. But then we have a constructed perspective about that do we assign meaning of individuals who have an addiction that we want to open up more opportunities for treatment, or do we see it as an issue of criminality and criminalization? So even if you have sort of the objectivist approach and you have the data, you still have the subjective kind of examination of that data itself. So recall back, like, Becker's last week was Becker's idea in terms of the outsiders, 1963. So it focused a lot about labeling theory, focused on that process of labeling, impact of labeling, thinking about being an outsider, like that whole process. There could be errors in labeling. I think it's kind of interesting to look at. So the labeling process, there may be errors in the application of the label. So it's possible that a person can commit an act of deviance or an act of crime. So let's say that I stole $5,000 from the place I worked at. So the actual act did happen, but then let's say a person's not caught, there's no labeling going on. So that's one possibility. There's an error going on there, like an act was committed, but there's no label. Could be that the act was committed and that there's a label. That would be like the one where there's that the error is not there. But then you get into the non-commission of an act, like say something didn't happen, like the person didn't steal, but they were labeled as someone who committed theft. So now we have this sort of error where there wasn't person did not do what they were identified as doing, but yet they get labeled as being deviant. And then it could be a person the person's engaging in conforming behavior and then they're not labeled. So that would be an accurate one as well. So anyway, just thinking about different combinations of relationships between labeling and the actual act itself. So a couple things to kind of consider, the social construction of deviance. So think about how things become criminalized, and then maybe even how things become decriminalized, like marijuana has become decriminalized. Think about like sodomy laws, decriminalization, criminalization. It was like 4 or 5. It was probably like, let's say, I'm going to say it was early 2020s, maybe late 20 teens, where it became a misdemeanor in the state of Oregon to be vaping or using an aerosoling, vaping a product in one's car when there was a minor in the car. So it's a misdemeanor offense. So it's a criminalization of using and vaping while in a vehicle with a minor in the car. So that's criminalization. So part of this area is like, well, how do things get constructed as being deviant? It could be the medicalization, like things become medicalized or demedicalized. Think about moral panics. That can be constructing these ideas about deviance or crime, and it create around a moral panic. And in this case, we're looking at historical, cultural, social influences on what's being defined as being deviant. Another area to look at is the consequences of labeling themselves. So, man, labels can have a detrimental or a positive impact on people's identity and their experience and their opportunities, or how they're kind of treated by others. So there's a lot of variability here. It's not like the label happens and that there's an automatic outcome for that label. It's one thing I kind of see sometimes in students writing about stuff about labeling theory. Says that student may state that, well, a person's labeled as being bad, therefore they become bad. It's like, well, I mean, that's a possibility for sure, but that's not the only option there. So that it's more nuanced probably in that space. Labels can have a real profound and detrimental impact on a person's identity and how other people see them and treat them. But it's not, it's a variable light switch versus on and off. So there's variability here. Sometimes labels are more neutral, sometimes more negative, sometimes more positive. But here in this case, we're looking at both the impact of labels on a person's identity, as well as how that label, once the person's been labeled and been labeled as a deviant or a criminal, that how does that shape the responses of other people, the perceptions of other people, and then future opportunities or experiences with other people based on that label. And then third is looking at social, like where did the source of these responses, within a formal setting. So looking at formal social control. So organizations and particular agents applying labels as, a mechanism of control, of formal social control. So we're looking at this kind of area. So focus on organizational responses, why are certain things being defined as deviant, other things not. Looking at research on individual agents. So influence, looking at the biases of ascribed statuses. So going back to like a race may become a master status. Race is an ascribed status. It's involuntary. People are born with a particular racial status. It's involuntary. And it could be that that those formal organizations respond to individuals different based on their ascribed status. And it could also be that sometimes organizations, um, apply labels and certain labels more frequently, less frequently, based on a lot of conditions. So political conditions, economic conditions, social conditions. Thinking about the war on drugs and the criminal justice system. I mean, that's like looking at that social control apparatus all the way from from the law enforcement to judicial system to jail, probation, parole. I mean, at every level that you can imagine of looking at these different institutions of social control and how they're responding to or engaging in labeling. So another area to look at, this is kind of an interesting application of Lemert's societal reaction perspective, and kind of defined it. I'll define that here in a minute, but kind of giving an idea from Henry that deviant behavior does not make a deviant, nor does the repetition of the behavior make a deviant identity. And I think this becomes really important and also pretty profound, is that if people engage in deviant behavior or criminal behavior, it doesn't make them a criminal or it doesn't make them a deviant. It takes that audience response. Even if people repeat or engage in some activity frequently, it doesn't make for a deviant identity. The identity starts to become, it starts to become in process once there's an identification by others that the person engaged in deviant or criminal behavior. Then it's possible that a deviant identity is going to be formed. So the precursor to the identity has to be a response from an audience. Deviance is a designation, a label that is attached to some individuals and not to others. So as I mentioned before, if you look at, let's just look at crime, for example, the majority of crime is never detected, never identified, never responded to. It goes invisible. It goes unidentified at least by law enforcement or the criminal justice system. So, there's no formal labeling going on in most cases. Now, this would not be true of things like homicide or something like that. But if you look at it as overall, all categories of crimes, misdemeanors, as well as felonies, most stuff goes undetected. And I think just kind of bring this up here to say that that deviance is a designation, a label that is attached to some people, not to others, so that it's there may be a higher frequency at which deviance and criminality is going on where people are not being labeled. And also those labels may be influenced, or likelihood of labeling may be influenced by things like that, about ascribed statuses or racial status or class and other factors. What Lemert is interested in is this called the societal reaction perspective. And the goal to show how deviance was shaped by and stabilized by efforts to actually stop or minimize the deviant behavior. So that deviance is shaped by the response. So this will make sense. We kind of work through this theory. So once again, sort of go back to the statement that deviance is being influenced by the response of the audience. So societal reaction, the reaction from the audience, could also be a facilitator for additional deviant or criminal behavior. And what Lemur kind of walks through or creates these three different, he created primary, secondary deviance, and more academics and more recent history added the tertiary deviance. Primary deviance is all deviance that's happened before being labeled as a deviant or being labeled as a person who's engaged in deviant behavior. So primary deviance, all before being labeled. Secondary deviance is what is the label has happened, the identification of being a criminal or deviant has happened, and then what's the impact of the label itself? So what happens afterwards? So it's post labeling. Think about like for the person who has been a convicted felon and served time within a state institution, and has been yes, served time in an institution, a correctional facility, and then they are released, and then they in some states can't vote. Some states, that the ability to find housing, the ability to find a job, like the way in which society is responding to this individual may actually make the likelihood of additional criminal behavior, deviant behavior. It may happen, it may increase as a result of the response from the audience. So that's all secondary deviance. I can think about it this way, that let's just say that somebody is like, I don't know, it's like the little kid, kid's like breaking some rules, and then, gets caught by the authorities, or with some friends who get caught by the authorities, and then they have to go through the juvenile correctional system. They get identified as being a juvie. They get treated differently by others. People are reacting, responding to them. They get like people at school, they get ridiculed and shamed. I mean, you just go down this sort of list. All that stuff now that's happening, that the reaction by others may actually drive further additional deviant or criminal behavior, which I think is just important to look at, but also fascinating to think about. Sometimes the efforts to stop, eliminate, or respond to it are actually contributing to the additional levels of deviance or crime. So now the audience, I think, gets implicated. Like the audience, it becomes part of the problem. So examination of the process, pre-deviance or pre-labeling, post-labeling, and looking at the impacts of stigma. So primary deviance, a lot of possible reasons may motivate a person for, you know, for theft or for engaging in illicit drug use. But it's minimal impact on identity. People maybe can neutralize things very well. They're in their own social group. Maybe people are experimenting with something and trying something out. They don't do it on a regular basis. People may work to distinguish themselves between, I'm not like other people who use that particular drug. So they make this distinction between self and other. And we can make a connection here to differential association a little bit, which Sutherland's idea that in subgroups, people learn deviant behavior, and they learn it in such similar ways that you learn conventional behavior, learning the techniques, ways to rationalize, justify particular behavior. And the influence of that group is going to vary based on the intensity of which people are involved in that group and the priority that people assign that particular group. So there could be for primary deviance, there could be a lot of different reasons. Deviance is not a part of a person's identity. They haven't been stigmatized. People may be in and out of doing things in particular acts. Now, what happens after becoming identified as being a deviant and being stigmatized? What's the response and reaction? That reaction, what's the next step in terms of maybe secondary level? So secondary reactions can range from small level stigma, could come from informal, from groups, family, friends, people know, colleagues, all the way to more formal. It could be something like a stigma of different degrees of intensity, all the way to very formal institutional discrimination, such as a person who was convicted of a felony can no longer apply for, can no longer vote, or during the war on drugs, that a person with a drug conviction could not receive federal financial aid. This would be the reaction. It's stigmatizing, but it's more about institutional discrimination, what's going on in that space. Examination secondary is looking at the impact of identity and then the impact of that stigma on future behavior. So it recognizes that responses to deviance may actually amplify deviance just based on those reactions. We could bring in Mead and Cooley here as part of last week's discussion, and bringing them in here to add to this discussion. So Mead, this idea of self, or Mead and Cooley are our theorists we go to think about ideas of the self, and that the ideas of self are being shaped and influenced by how we how we view others view us and see us, and the judgment we're receiving from others. It's part of the formation of self. So stigma is real. Stigma is powerful. Stigma is something to navigate. Stigma can be helpful in reshaping, encouraging social control of reshaping a person's behavior. It can also be kind of backfire, where that kind of social control could be not only, it could be detrimental because of all these reactions that are, that a person receives, um, could create another level of problem. A person comes to believe that they are or have a deviant identity rather than a person who deviates. And I think that's when we know secondary deviance is going on. When people start to see that they have a deviant identity, that they are deviant, that they are separate from everybody, from other people in society, not just someone who does deviate. It's not an on and off switch. It's a process that occurs over time. It's like a dimmer switch. For secondary deviance to happen, individuals have to accept the label, and then the audience provides additional responses, both in terms of the number of responses as well as the intensity or the strength of those responses. Impacts of labels vary based on a person's biography, their history, their social status, their status security, their networks. It's possible that responses include conformity, changing behavior, or rejecting labels or rejecting the labelers, or fairly neutral. Again, it's not like a one size fits all. Navigating a deviant status. So deviant status, there's a judgment going on of the moral worth of a person by specific others, or by society more generally. This addresses the social and cultural meanings that are associated with attitude, behaviors, or conditions. So we think about what gets defined as being deviant as a reflection of those larger social cultural meanings. So that deviant status is a process of comes about based on the meaning that people are assigning things. The case of ascribed status versus achieved status and its impact on identity and personal experiences. So ascribed status, again, involuntary, assigned at birth. Gender is an ascribed status. Race is an ascribed status. Achieved status is something that people have earned. A person moves into a different occupation, a different social class. This is an achieved status. And to be ascribed a status, or your ascribed status in terms, let's say, gender or in terms of race, and that impact of that may impact the labeling process, so that individuals of color may be more likely to be identified or to have the label, a stigmatizing label applied to them, especially if we intersect class into this as well, that there's class influences, and this could have different impacts. The status level of a person have different impacts on the likelihood of being labeled, and then the impact of that label on a person's identity. This person's been identified as being deviant or criminal. It's going to be it's most likely going to be a master status. And it's going to vary, right? So if I got caught. I was speeding 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. I ended up I get caught, I get a fine, I go to traffic school. It's pretty low level, versus something much more significant. I mean, the traffic, violation is not going to be a master status thing to me. Like, I feel like, like I'm a traffic violator and I have this deviant status and people respond to me in different ways. I mean, that's just not a significant enough form of crime to warrant that kind of response. But certain things are, right? Like to be serve time in prison and to be a convicted felon. That's a huge master status that a person has to navigate. And I don't know, is there a benefit to master status? And I guess, for some, it can be an important identity for themselves. It can be a reminder. It can be something that people, they learn how to navigate and be in that space, not let it define them. There's a powerful perspective offered by Brian Stevenson, who's devoted most of his life to working with people in the criminal justice system, addressing racial inequities in the criminal justice system. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, and in some of his talks, he talks about how people are more than the worst thing they ever done. And this is kind of his language. He said, if somebody has committed theft, they're more than a thief. If somebody's committed murder, they're more than a murderer. If somebody's engaged in drug dealing, they're more than a dealer. And I think what he's doing with that is recognizing, let's see the importance of seeing the human, um, that people are much more complex than the worst thing that they've ever done in their lives. And that worst thing could be like this master status, and that master status could have a lot of baggage attached to it. And a lot of problems with that idea of master status is that people get defined that way. We don't get to see the complexity of an individual. And then that master status could have profound impacts on an individual, their own identity and their own experience, like the self-fulfilling prophecy. They start to believe things about themselves. And then there's a sort of auxiliary status, which are the expectations that go along with the master status itself. So if I was a convicted felon, there would be expectations that go along with that master status. This would be the auxiliary status, and it could potentially be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Stigmatization and discrimination are not isolated phenomena or the expression of individual attitudes, but are social processes. So stigma and discrimination, they're not just like happen here in chance, they're more patterned. And it's not just about like, one person pointing a finger. It's like there's something going on. It's a social process in which people are pointing fingers, but this is about something going on at a much larger level within structure, culture, society of why people are pointing fingers. And people are pointing fingers in a way to attempt to maintain social control and to produce and to reproduce social inequalities. I think it's kind of interesting that Henry brings up Parker and Agelton, talking about stigma as something that is produced and used in order to help order society. It's an instrument of social control. Stigma is used by groups that are more powerful to justify and reinforce inequalities and to enforce social control. So not everybody has the equal ability to apply labels. Not everybody is, even if labels are applied to them, do the labels stick? I think the issue of power becomes important to recognize. Recall that responses to labeling of deviance and stigma may vary. At times, individuals may broadcast the stigma to affirm a position in a social group. So people may own it, they may communicate it, they may wear it right on their sleeve so they can communicate their status to the group, to their social group, or to engage in an act of defiance against the labelers. Like somebody labels me as blank, then I'm saying, well, I am that, as a way kind of like to shove it back at the individual labelers. So, I mean, people can respond to labels in a lot of different ways. Stigma is an instrument of control. It can be also a reinforcer of inequality. So for example, the medicalization of homosexuality, of drug offenses, felony convictions, or of homosexuality, the medicalization of homosexuality, then the demedicalization, less social control now in that space. The way we look at drug offenses and felony convictions, there's a lot of social control in that, a lot of labeling in that. Some of that's productive, some of that's useful. Some of that, as we looked at, was with a Leimert societal reaction perspective. Some of that pointing the finger and labeling is actually counterproductive. And actually, it's probably about the audience more than it is about the individual. And then finally, we're up to the theory of office, or actually two more. Theory of office. And what the theory of the office is the way that workers within institutions interact with individuals who are there because of their deviant status or criminal status. So how do people who work in institutions like jails and prisons, mental health, even education, who are working with individuals who are identified as deviant or criminal, how do they what's the theory of, how do individual workers work in this particular space? What's the meaning they assign these individuals? How do they go about this process? So it's an examination of labeling basically within institutions and the workers. Goffman did a lot of work on stigma, notes in the management of a spoiled identity in 1963. So a book specifically about stigma. And then he spent a couple years, well, I'm not sure it was a couple years, but he spent time within mental health institutions, asylums, and making observations about how patients and how staff members and how they interact with each other and these interaction rituals. And here's a couple of kind of points from that kind of work is that workers who work in these facilities and these places, they have a front stage and they have a backstage performance. That if you're a guard and you're working with, and you are full on in a cell block with inmates, you are engaged, those individuals, those workers are engaged in a performance in a different way than they're backstage when they're just with their coworkers and they're not around inmates. Workers separate out and treat differently people who are normal deviants from deviant others, which is super fascinating. So that, like in a prison setting, guards will make a distinction between those who are bad and good, or they're making these distinctions between individuals who are there. It's also the theory of the office, gets into the institutional level kind of things about understanding how people, the process of assigning people a deviant or criminal identity or label. What's the formal process in which that happens? And is there a process when a person's completed their time? What's that ritual and process like when a person's served their time, so to speak? So we call these things, like in prisons, when a person enters a prison, they go through a degradation ceremony, get stripped, parts of their identity, it gets or they get, they don't have the individual expressions of identity get minimized. So everybody has to wear the same uniform. Go through this process that's really about mortifying the self or defocusing, for lack of better words, to degrade the individual in order to, and the thought is that break down the individual to rebuild the individual. So prisons are a total institution. They're not the only one. There's a lot of different examples of total institutions, but institutions can sometimes, what's interesting to look at the theory of the office is what goes on in terms of the application, like how are the inmates being treated, or people who are a deviant or criminal, how are they being treated and responded to by the workers? What's the way in which that kind of operates? I won't go through this. We can kind of leave this one be. Like Rosenhan's study, was kind of go to the last one. Spoiled identity. So Goffman has this idea that deviance is what he calls a spoiled identity. Imagine, like, for Goffman is like the theory of dramaturgy, that impression management. So imagine you are an actor on stage, and then all of a sudden, as an actor on stage, something happens and somebody kind of like takes somebody really challenges your script or challenges your role, and no longer can you engage in that role in the same way. And people, the audience is heckling you and stigmatizing you. And now all of a sudden you have this spoiled identity. You can't engage in that same performance on stage in the same way as before. Parts of of a person's identity have been spoiled. They've been brought into question. Spotlight has been shined on them. People are viewed as being less than. There's something going on. It's a spoiling of one's identity. A person's identity or actions or conditions that calls into questions their full humanity. The person's devalued, spoiled, or flawed in the eyes of others. So think back also to Cooley and Mead, is what happens in circumstances when people are no longer viewed by an audience in the same way. They've been stigmatized. Parts of their identity are spoiled. They're not seen in terms of their full humanity. This kind of thing. And then there's the discredited, where there's a discreditable. So people are aware of the implications if the potential of being assigned a deviant label. So let's say a person's engaging in drug use, but they're not, it's kind of going on secretly. They're discreditable. So eventually they know they could get caught. They know they could get a deviant status attached to them. So they're discreditable. Eventually, if they get caught and they get labeled, then they're discredited. Like now, all of a sudden, it's a more formal thing. So people may engage in passing. A person who's experimenting or using illicit drugs, illegal drugs, maybe passing, or somebody who's consuming a lot of alcohol, and there's problems associated with their alcohol consumption, but they're keeping it hidden from family members and from colleagues that they're passing. They're trying to pass to somebody who doesn't have a drinking problem because they're aware of what might happen if other people saw that, their level of drinking and the problems that it was causing. So passing is a way of maintaining a performance in front of a particular audience. It's impression management. Sometimes people engage in deviance disavowal and goal of putting to rest a deviant master status. So rejecting the label itself. So disavowing the label. And maybe separating out, that was my former self, this is my current self. So making a distinction between trying to shed that deviant label status. Sometimes people make appeals for exceptions and accommodations, that, I've been clean for 30 years. This is what I've done. This is a way of trying to manage a person, manage an impression in front of a group of people, because people might be aware that if somebody became aware of a person's drug use history, that they may be viewed in a different way. So maybe very guarded about when to reveal that history. So maybe a lot of times a person's just passing. So keeping that information from public view. At other times, making that information available to others, but then asking for an appeal to some accommodation or exception or forgiveness, or letting go and seeing the person in a current state and not a former state. And then this next bullet points, kind of like a technique of neutralization, right? And there's a lot of different ways we can make those connections to that. All right. So that is it for today. It's complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on in this space. Hopefully that kind of broke down things in some digestible chunks. Henry, in these two chapters, he's kind of weaving the story about labeling theories, offering ideas about societal reaction perspective in multiple chapters. So sometimes it's hard to keep it more tightly structured. And one of my goals of these videos this week and last week was to put some more organization and structure around things, to put things in some cleaner categories or themes, and then be able to talk about them to help you better understand the material. All right. Have a great day. Thanks for all you do. Be safe, be well.